Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for our conversation, Dostoevsky for the 21st Century, Reflections on the Bicentenary. Exactly 1 week ago, on November 11th, the lovers of literature and of Russian culture celebrated this important anniversary, the bicentennial of Fyodor Dostoevsky. According to the UNESCO database, he is the most translated Russian novelist of all, and over 100 film adaptations from around the world testify to the holding power of his writings. What we're going to discuss today is his legacy and why this legacy is still so relevant, what draws the 21st century scholars and translators to his works, and how do contemporary readers engage with his characters. Before I start, I just want to remind our viewers that you can stay up to date with our work through our Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs and our podcasts. Each speaker of today's speakers will give some short opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. You can submit your questions throughout the program via email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter to @KennanInstitute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and your affiliation. Without further ado, we're going to get started here, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. She is Dr. Tatiana Kovalevskaya. She received her PhD from Yale University and a Doctorate of Science in Philosophy from Moscow State University. She holds the rank of full professor at the European Languages Department of the Russian State University for the Humanities. She has published numerous scholarly works. Her latest work is entitled Fyodor Dostoevsky on the Dignity of the Human Person. This bilingual Russian-English textbook was awarded a diploma in Best Book in the Humanities nomination at the 2020 Best Academic Book competition. Tatiana, the floor is yours. You have to unmute.
Sorry, that keeps happening to us in this new world. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, and I'm very happy to be here with my distinguished colleagues. And I'm very pleased to be able to share a few words about what I think is Dostoevsky's importance for the already 21st century. And his influence can be discussed in a variety of ways. His works are adapted, as Will mentioned, to both big and small screens. They have been made into movies that are directly based on Dostoevsky. They have served as inspirations for stories set in other countries and times. Literary scholars have been tracing the influence Dostoevsky's works had on literature throughout the world. And even when you watch animation, you can sometimes encounter Dostoevsky. You watch Wallace and Gromit ends up in jail and reads a book, Crime and Punishment, with the author given as Fyodor Dostoevsky. And then you know that Dostoevsky has arrived into kind of global cultural parlance. But he is a fact of culture beyond Russia. And I can speak at length on Dostoevsky's motifs anywhere, from Lucchino Visconti's Rocky and his brothers to Marvel's superhero flick The Avengers. I can trace his influence in Russian poetry of the early 20th century or in the writings of the Dutch author Tim Krabbe. But this is not what I would like to discuss today as manifestations of his importance in influence. What interests me more is how he shapes or is perceived to shape something greater, something that I would call worldviews, ways of thinking, ways of life. In 1905, Dmitry Merezhkovsky, a Russian poet, writer, thinker, and a would-be religious figure, wrote a book called L. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, where he called Dostoevsky a seer into the secrets of spirit, as opposed to Tolstoy being a seer into the secrets of flesh. And that definition emphasizes one principal feature of Dostoevsky's poetic world. No matter how realistic it was in the depiction of the insulted and the injured, the poor and the downtrodden. The roots of all problems are never purely social. The root of people's problem always ultimately go back to their philosophy of life, and particularly to their interactions with other people. And this is, I think, one of the crucial takeaways from Dostoevsky's works. And that also makes Dostoevsky an excellent source for overarching philosophical ideas. He is always called a writer who philosophizes and even theologizes in poetic images. Another important aspect of the effect Dostoevsky has on his readers lies in his very unusual poetic method. It has been defined in various ways. It was called a fantastic realism. That's actually a paraphrase of Dostoevsky's own words, but scholars have shown that initially they didn't have much to do with his writing principles. He himself called it the realism in the highest sense. These are Dostoevsky's own words. One of the most influential and popular definitions belongs to Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian and Soviet thinker, who said that Dostoevsky wrote polyphonic novels. And by that, he meant that each character's voice in Dostoevsky's work is equal to every other. And there is no poetically dominant voice that guides Dostoevsky's readers toward an unmistakable conclusion they will inevitably draw from reading him. Whether Bakhtin himself was guided by the overall relativist thrust of European philosophy, or whether he used Dostoevsky as a cover to lash out against the oppressive Soviet political climate that demanded complete and utter unanimity in following the only true Marxist philosophy, or whether it was an odd combination of both. But probably no other writer could have furnished Bakhtin with the material he needed and could have answered Bakhtin's needs better. Because Dostoevsky indeed did have a very unusual approach to writing. When he suggests an idea, he is very aware that any idea can be twisted beyond recognition, or it can be twisted just a little bit and still lose its essential point. And he fills his novels with twisted ideas that readers have to wade through and untangle. These ideas are sometimes presented as so convincingly, in such a convincing manner, that readers can choose them instead of what Dostoevsky would want them to choose. Yet, as I think will be obvious from the story that I'm going to tell next, it is quite clear that Dostoevsky wants what Dostoevsky wants to say, and that he says it quite successfully. In addition to being a writer, Dostoevsky was also a very active columnist, as we would say, would call him today. People today repeatedly quote his political statements and argue over them incessantly. But what is interesting is the way that not only the internet's dwellers engage with Dostoevsky, but how some of Russia's real policymakers engage with his works and his philosophy. In the year 2004, Anatoly Chubais, one of Russia's most controversial economists cum politicians, gave an interview to the Financial Times. Just for a bit of context, Chubais's name is associated mostly with the privatization campaign implemented in the wake of the collapse of the USSR. A reporter asked Chubais whether he thought that capitalism is not a good fit for Russia, given its people's hatred for the rich and their faith in the poor's moral superiority. That's a quote from the article. And before giving a qualified no as an answer to the question, Chubais literally tore into Dostoevsky, and I quote, "You know, I have been rereading Dostoevsky in the last few months, and I feel almost physical hatred toward the man. He is certainly a genius, but his notion of Russians as an elect holy people, his cult of suffering, and the false choice, or even the wrong way of life the Russian language offers to interpretations, he suggests, make me wish to tear him to pieces," end quote. This is really a remarkable statement, that Chubais feels that Dostoevsky is responsible for what he sees as the wrong way to live, a false choice offered to Russians. It is actually quite amazing to think that a person who was among the leaders of very real kind of very down-to-earth economic reforms that which switched Russia from socialism to capitalism had Dostoevsky on his mind. So much so that Dostoevsky is the first writer that popped into his head when he was asked about national sentiments and the national worldview. So despite what Bakhtin had to say about equal voices in Dostoevsky, even those readers who disagree with him, and by him I mean Dostoevsky, walk away from him seeing his message very clearly. Some agree with him, some disagree and fight him, but that in no way diminishes his significance. Whatever their motive, whether they want to follow Dostoevsky or to fight him, people come to Dostoevsky to try to understand themselves or other people around them. And then there is the question of what Dostoevsky's message actually is. It's important to remember that Dostoevsky was a deeply religious writer and thinker, and that needs to be kept in mind. His characters consistently debate religious matters, read the Gospels, and Dostoevsky takes his inspiration from the Bible when he claims, in full accord with Orthodox mystic theology, that human destiny is to become deified, to become one with God. What is important, however, is the path he suggests for it. And I think that this is what makes him very relevant always. And that brings me to my concluding remarks that from the late 19th century, Dostoevsky was accused of preaching suffering as the right way of life, which is rather strange since Dostoevsky knew quite a lot about suffering. At the age of 16, he lost his mother. A few years later, his father died. And while the official cause of death was apoplexy, a Dostoevsky family legend claimed that he was murdered by his own serfs, and that allegedly the news of his death provoked Dostoevsky's first epileptic seizure. There are debates on the father's death going on still, but the fact that Dostoevsky was an epileptic is indisputable, and the disease left its indelible imprint on his life. At the age of 28, Dostoevsky was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for a political crime, which consisted in participating in a political society and reading out a letter that was deemed revolutionary and subversive. The sentence was commuted at the last moment, was Dostoevsky had already been brought to the place of execution and was awaiting to be put in front of a firing squad. Instead, he was sentenced to hard labor and spent 4 years in a prison in Siberia, of which he left a fictionalized account, Notes from the House of the Dead. So Dostoevsky actually knew more about suffering than many of his contemporaries or readers, and he acknowledged its reality, its ubiquitous nature, and the destructive power and the destructive impact on the human psyche. But throughout these experiences that could easily turn a person into a misanthrope and a general pessimist, he also remained a deeply humanist thinker. The consistent feature of all of Dostoevsky's writings, be they journalistic or literary, is the insistence that we're all united by our common humanity. And the way to what Dostoevsky envisions as human destiny is to accept other people, to see through things that might repel us, to see through brutality, cruelty, ugliness, both physical and moral, to see through all that to our common humanity. And we need to open up to people, to give themselves to each other fully while always remaining ourselves. It does not mean that we should excuse crime and cruelty. We certainly need to work towards eliminating them. But it doesn't mean that crime and cruelty should induce us to close ourselves off from other people. Dostoevsky certainly was not saying that it is something that is very easy. He was ready to say that it was so hard as to seem nearly impossible. But it does not mean that we should give up on that or on each other. And I think that this message of universal humanity, that we need to see through too, regardless of other people's possibly repulsive attributes, is an important message that is universally relatable. It is just so hard sometimes that it is far easier to brand Dostoevsky as a proponent of something we do not like and stop there. Trouble is that philosophy lays the responsibility for people's life directly on people and not some as society. And that's another thing that is hard to deal with. Dostoevsky would acknowledge that readily, but for him, that was no reason to give up. And I think that this humanistic message is Dostoevsky's most important legacy that any reader can relate to. Thank you very much. I hope I did not break my time limit.
You're exactly on time, Tatiana, so thank you very much for your excellent presentation and getting us started. Just before I introduce my next speaker, I just want to remind everyone that you can send your questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter to @KennanInstitute, or on our Facebook page. And please include your name and affiliation. Our next speaker is Dr. Oliver Reddy. He is a research fellow in Russian literature and culture at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and the author of Persistent Folly, Russian Writers in Search of Wisdom. His translation of Crime and Punishment is published by Penguin Classics and was shortlisted for the PEN Translation Prize in 2016. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation to speak. We didn't compare in detail what we were going to say, but I'm glad to note that I think what I will say will supplement in many ways what Tatiana's been saying about the common human message of Dostoevsky's work and the methods by which he tries to achieve that. I suppose the methods is partly what I will be focusing on, given that I'm the translator on the panel. I'd like to share some of my reflections on my experience translating his best-known novel, Crime and Punishment, how that process changed and shaped my own view of Dostoevsky as an artist and my understanding of how he affects us as readers. Although I have to say that that sense of how he affects us has really been brought home to me by the sheer volume of sort of correspondence and reactions I've had since the publication of the translation, just from readers all over the world who want to continue the dialogue that Dostoevsky starts and who write to me, not necessarily to talk about issues of translation, although they sometimes do, but to ask about the big questions that not just Crime and Punishment, but all the novels pose. So in a way, my perspective is a very close-up perspective. As a translator, you have a very intimate access to the text, and that was really something I wanted to reinforce in a way, because Dostoevsky comes with so much baggage, cultural baggage, that when I was asked to do this and when I convinced myself to do it, I decided to put everything aside and just sit in the study and write out my translation by hand and not look at other books as best as I could. And that method certainly increased my admiration for, enabled me to see things about Dostoevsky's style in particular that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and increased my admiration for his verbal artistry, his verbal resourcefulness, things that have been routinely knocked by his very influential critics, most famously Nabokov, under whose sway I think I had previously been in my estimation of Dostoevsky. In fact, as an undergraduate, I managed to get through my degree in Russian without reading a single line by him. But actually looking back now in 2021, several years later, what strikes me most about Dostoevsky's writing, and this novel in particular, is how it draws its power by indicating modes of understanding and self-knowledge that lie beyond the words that his characters say and use. And this really dovetails with what Tatiana was saying. I'm tempted to say that there's a search for a universal language of human communication and experience in this novel that we could then map out across Dostoevsky's oeuvre in general. And to say this is quite a recent thought that occurred to me, so it's quite tentative in a way, but I'm glad to have a chance to air it here. And it seems to me that this idea of a universal language is a fitting idea to be exploring in this bicentenary year, and an event like this one that's considering his enduring international appeal. Just a brief digression to say that, of course, there's a paradox here. This search for a universal language is carried out through a very specific language, Russian, and the inadequate words of his characters, especially Raskolnikov, the murderer, which dominate the novel. And this is a very characteristic Dostoevskian paradox. It's connected to one I discuss in my introduction. In this novel, Dostoevsky is portraying a very literary type, Raskolnikov, whose problems can be attributed to a very significant extent to his immersion in other books, in text, in theory, his distance from what Dostoevsky would call living life, from the soil of Russian life. And yet, of course, it's precisely through literature, through this brilliantly constructed novel, that Dostoevsky is trying to show us, at the same time, the development of Raskolnikov, his first steps towards some kind of change, the path by which he can find himself. This is a very important idea for Dostoevsky. It comes out in his Pushkin speech at the end of his life. This is what he says. Pushkin showed Russia the solution to its cursed question that the truth is not outside you, the truth is within you. Okay, so my brief remarks to indicate the search for a universal language are going to fall in three sections. Firstly, the language with which Raskolnikov, the main character, thinks and speaks in the novel, and its inadequacy, its insufficiency to his needs. Secondly, the role of comedy in permitting him to move towards some kind of self-knowledge. And thirdly, the role of a single crucial verbal prefix in all of this. And I'll leave that hanging in the air like a kind of mystery until I get there. So language, I mean, when we think about this novel, and when you look at the cover of the novel, it's always, got axes and murder and blood. And one thinks this is necessarily a novel about deeds, first and foremost, bloody deeds. It's much more, it seems to me, about words and about the agency of words. But of course, this dichotomy of words and deeds was an absolutely crucial one in Russian history at this moment. All these intellectuals thinking, when will our words finally become deeds? When will we be able to redeem sort of Russia and sort out the injustices that we see around us? And that's where the novel begins, with Raskolnikov wondering, here I am thinking, when I'm actually going to do something. And we see right from the first page, I'm just going to read you a tiny little bit, how his language kind of loops back on itself and sort of cancels itself out. So he asks himself, here's a question. What do people fear most? A new step, a new word of their own. That's what they fear most. But I'm talking too much. That's why I never do anything. Or maybe it's because I never do anything that I'm always talking. This is funny, and it's also sort of self-canceling. And what really struck me as I was translating this first part in the lead up to the murder was how narrow the sort of lexical range of Raskolnikov's thoughts are. He keeps coming back again and again to the same individual words. And I'm not going to go into that detail now. So that it's not just his mind that's mirroring the straitened and oppressive circumstances that he lives in, his poverty, his lack of opportunity, his tiny room, his garret in an overcrowded area of St. Petersburg. It's actually the words with which he thinks, that he keeps coming back to the same useless kind of circumlocutions, euphemisms for what he wants to do. So he talks about his murder as just a kind of diela, a deed of some kind. He doesn't really want to name it for what it is. In other words, the language with which he talks to himself isn't helping him, and nor is the language with which others at this stage communicate to him. So his mother's long letter, which he kind of understands, I think, as a form of emotional blackmail, is something that pushes him undoubtedly towards the crime he commits. Okay, moving on to humor and comedy. This strikes me as such a vital part of Dostoevsky's legacy, one that scholars are increasingly recognizing. There was a conference recently, Funny Dostoevsky, which translators are also paying more attention to. Dostoevsky is funny. But when I talk about his comedy, I don't mean discrete comic scenes. I don't mean things that set off the tragedy. I mean the actual comic perspective that underpins everything. And we should also look at his most important predecessor here, Gogol. If you take out the comedy from Gogol's work, which is what happened, what are you left with? You're left with the death of his creative talent, and his quick descent into a very sort of dogmatic literature, which came out in his letters in his later life, and his sense of drying up as a writer. Dostoevsky recognized this. And Tatiana mentioned the crime for which he was sent to Siberia, spent almost 10 years there. And that was specifically for reading out a politically inflammatory letter from Russia's main critic of the time, Gilinski, in which Gilinski wrote to Gogol, lamenting this switch in his former protege to this very serious type of moralistic writing that he saw as supporting the Russian autocratic and religious regime. What happens if you take out the humor from Dostoevsky? Well, we see that too in Dostoevsky's journalism, sometimes very insightful, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes funny too, but often verbose and repetitive, often filled with a kind of humorless hatred, sometimes in his later years, and some atrocious prejudice. Comedy is the element by which Dostoevsky became wiser than he would have done through a purely serious approach, whatever that means. And in this novel, it's absolutely critical, and it massively complicates the translator's task, because you're constantly trying to catch this knife edge between comedy and tragedy that the novel plays on. I think my own translation was going absolutely nowhere until it was picked up by a British critic called A.N. Wilson, who's very famous over here. And he wrote in his review, "There are only 3 writers known to me who can do this blend of high comedy, which at the same time makes you weep. The Shakespeare who created Falstaff, Dickens, and Dostoevsky." And that means that above all, when we read Dostoevsky and when you translate Dostoevsky, you have to be alert to tone, not just the meaning of words, but the tone in which they are said. And in fact, we're alerted to this very early on when Raskolnikov is dissecting this letter from his mother, and he says it's the tone we need to listen to. But then later on in the novel, when you have these wonderful interrogation scenes between the investigator, Porfiry Petrovich, and Raskolnikov, everything depends on the tone in which we think words are being said. So Tatiana, you talked about suffering and its dominance in Dostoevsky's work. Well, in this scene, in one of those chapters, you've got Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator, telling Raskolnikov, maybe you should do a bit of suffering. And he says in Russian, "Postradайте." So it came out in my translation as follows. A change of air is what you need. Suffering also has a lot to be said for it, So do a bit of that. So do a bit of that is my sort of rather humorous rendition of that postradайте, that tiny prefix po. What I'm trying to get at here is that these characters in the novel are aware that they're playing roles at various points. In this conversation, the investigator is aware. He knows that Raskolnikov did it. Raskolnikov knows deep down that the investigator knows that he did it. Not just that. In this conversation, Porfiry knows that he's the kind of teacher who's going to guide Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov also fears that, but he has to act as if he isn't any of these things. And they both kind of ham it up and they sort of stage their respective roles. So you get this element of theater, comedy, and provocation. And interestingly, it's that does most to change Raskolnikov, to get through to him. Porfiry sort of drives him mad in a way by knocking him off balance all the time with these strange comments. In the end, in the longer process, he really drives Raskolnikov sane, because it's through that, by being knocked out of his own usual thoughts, that he's able to sort of find himself again. So comedy works with words, but it also somehow exceeds what words can do. And that's kind of getting back to this idea of the universal language. A straight approach to Raskolnikov would not have worked. It's ambivalence that allowed for by comedy that achieves all this. There's, of course, another character in the novel who also has a crucial role, the woman who loves Raskolnikov, Sonia, and she too manages to affect him, again, not really through words. She's quite inarticulate, but often through silence. It's another subject that we could look at. So too, the whole language of gestures, another aspect of this universal language. And it'd be interesting to see how what I'm saying fits in with Bakhtin, who was mentioned by Tatiana, and all his work on dialogue in Dostoevsky. Okay, now the last part of my talk, I hope I'm not running over already, is about this little prefix, перья. Okay, it means in Russian over, across, can also mean again. It's there in the title of the novel, переступление, stepping across. It shouldn't really be crime and punishment, it should be transgression and punishment if we want to be closer to that idea. That word is there twice in the last paragraph of the novel, that prefix, sorry. Переход, the idea of Raskolnikov moving across to a different category of human beings, and перерождение, rebirth. And it's there right at the heart of the novel in a different перья word, not переход, crossing over, but перевод, translation. I was fascinated by the fact that translation, although it doesn't seem it, is itself central to this novel. At the very, and possibly the most important chapter, where Sonia reads to Raskolnikov the story of the raising of Lazarus, we are specifically told that she is reading from the Russian translation. This Russian translation was something new at the time. It was in vernacular Russian that had previously not been available. There's another crucial scene of translation. Raskolnikov's best friend, Razumikhin, is a translator, but not a very good one. And he says to Raskolnikov, why don't you translate? And we're given to understand that Raskolnikov, who's very sensitive, would be a good translator. Raskolnikov says, I don't need translations. And the next moment he crosses a bridge, a woman gives him some money because she takes him for a beggar, and he throws it into the river. And the narrator comes in to say, with that moment, he cut himself off from all humanity. So this idea of translation connecting us as human beings. Why is this so important? And this is moving me to my final points. When we look at Dostoevsky's worldview, in some ways it's quite rigid. There's a vertical axis, it's his spiritual worldview. He sees man, as human beings in general, as being caught between an ideal that they can never attain, an ideal of selflessness, which he sees embodied in Jesus Christ, and the reality of our human fallen selves, our desires, our animal self, our ego, as he puts it, our self. And he says that oscillation between the higher ideal and the lower truth of our nature is never going to be resolved in human life. We're just going to carry on. There's no end to the journey here. But what I'd like to suggest is also this horizontal axis where characters can change in Dostoevsky. And all these period words are about that, about how on this incompletable journey, we can nevertheless cross into different states of being. We can be transposed. And Raskolnikov, what's happening to him in this novel, what we feel as readers happens to him by the end, is that he has in a way been translated back into his real self. This man who's taken all of these foreign ideas in half understood form from his university education, is, I think Dostoevsky wanted us to understand, being translated back into his true inner self, just as Dostoevsky felt that Russia itself needed to be translated back into its true self to find its soil again. This is what Chadaev, a very important philosopher a few decades before, had said, that in Russia we are all strangers to ourselves and we need to kind of find ourselves again. And here, of course, the notion of translation begins to sound a bit mystical, and I think it was for Dostoevsky. He thought about it a lot. He began his career as a translator, translating Balzac. He ended it with a speech about Pushkin, in which he talked about Pushkin's incredible ability, his universal receptivity, his ability to re-embody another period word, перевоплощаться, into other cultures' characters. He said Shakespeare gives us Italians, but all the Italians sound a bit like Brits. When Pushkin goes to Don Juan or something, he becomes that culture. So translation for Dostoevsky is always kind of an improvement on the original, breaking all the rules of what we're supposed to do as translators. And genius is that ability to transpose something to a higher form. So his theory, I think, is that we write in one language and we communicate to one another in one specific language. But we know that language, the words we use are provisional in a way, that they can potentially be transposed into something more universal. I think he felt that about his own work. He was very honest. He knew that some of his own works hadn't communicated what he wanted them to communicate. The Double, for example, which he rewrote at the same time, in more or less the same years that he was doing Crime and Punishment. Even then, when he rewrote it, he said, I'm still not pleased with it. It's too long. I didn't express it properly, but I know there's something brilliant there. It's almost as if he's saying to his people who come after him, you go and find that idea. You adapt or transpose what I was trying to do. And I think in what I'm saying that connects to Dostoevsky's legacy. He left us with an enormous number of characters, stories that are just waiting to be transposed into other media or to be continued by other characters, or he's giving us characters such as in Crime and Punishment, where one could take any character in the novel, not just the main one, but even secondary characters like Katerina Ivanovna, Marmelado's wife, and make a whole novel about them. Or one could rewrite a novel from the perspective of Sonia, for example. So I think it's his faith in the ability of humans to translate, to transpose themselves that accounts to a large extent for Dostoevsky's cultural longevity. And I think also transcends some of the prejudices of his later years. Lastly, I was very struck, last week we had a half-an-hour program on BBC Radio 4 by Rowan Williams, who's written very well on Dostoevsky. And he made a comment, a revealing comment that echoed, I think, unconsciously Chadaev's comment. Rowan Williams said, if you've ever felt that you're a stranger to yourself, then Dostoevsky is the writer for you. He said it more or less in those words. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oliver. Before we go to our final speaker, I just want to remind everyone that you can send your questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter to @Kennan Institute, and on our Facebook page. Our final speaker to this morning is Dr. Caitlin Shirley. Dr. Shirley earned her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin in 2019, and her dissertation is entitled Dostoevsky and the Russo Trap, considerations on the man of nature and truth, and on proposed reformation. After graduating, she started the Dostoevsky, or doesn't she, social media accounts on Instagram and other social media. And during the COVID crisis, she started a book club and online fan community on Discord dedicated to enjoying the works of Dostoevsky. So, Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for including me on this panel. Really excited to be here. So I run some social media accounts where we talk about Dostoevsky all day, and that's what I'm going to be discussing today. I wanted to, before I really get started, just share some of the memes that we share on this account and a little bit of the history behind it. I graduated in 2019 and I started this account in the fall of that year. I had followed some literary meme accounts on Instagram, Twitter, you know, people being funny about things I'm passionate about. And I thought, you know, I saw a Shirley Jackson meme account and I thought, oh, well, let's do a single author meme account about Dostoevsky. And so I post some of my own personal content as well as content that I source from other people on the internet. And it's a really interesting community. And I'll just share my screen with a couple of these memes on it. Sorry about the technology. So here we have, this is a popular meme format, the maladaptive pattern and after cognitive restructuring. So maladaptive pattern, I'll kill and rob this pawnbroker. Now I'm dope like Napoleon, depression and fainting. After cognitive restructuring, I'll kill and rob this pawnbroker. I should accept my suffering and be redeemed by it, still depressed. So it just, they're just kind of silly little memes. We have this one I was reminded of during Tatiana's talk, Dostoevsky character being whipped while in prison. Aha, it's pain, but it is life. Such a singular wonder. I would not trade it for anything. Me, really tired in the morning, eating a granola bar, illegible. I have this one, which I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more. Dostoevsky is the woman handing some food to the bunny with a knife behind the back. Raskolnikov's redemption arc being the food. Enjoyers of deranged men get the food, but behind your back, you're going to stab him with Rogojin's confession, or Stavrogin's confession. And then this is another just popular format. Dostoevsky, I'm going to create a literature that is so polyphonic. So we just have a lot of fun with Dostoevsky in the world that the community that I'm working with. We have people in the book club that run the gambit of ages, from 15 years old in Scotland to 60 years old in Texas to a high school teacher in Turkey. People are reading in all kinds of languages, and together, I think for me, after earning my degree, it was kind of important for me to continue engaging with this work that I've dedicated much of my life to in researching and reading Dostoevsky. And I think having fun with it is one of the most important ways to keep Dostoevsky relevant. I mean, this is internet discourse, a lot of it is just having fun, poking fun, taking the mickey out of things. And Dostoevsky, as Oliver was saying, he's funny. There are funny moments, not just pointed, obvious funny moments. There's funny stuff going on in there. And I think when you can make a joke, make a meme about it, you're really demonstrating a mastery of the subject. And so, you know, we'll be having our book club discussions about demons, and someone from my book club made that meme with the woman and the rabbit because we were discussing, you know, the question in the Brothers Karamazov, who has the right to forgive? And we were discussing in demons, who has the right to condemn? Because Stavrogin confesses to what, you know, some people would say is unforgivable. But who has the right to decide that was the question we were really analyzing in this meeting. And after you read Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov's redemption arc is presented rather palatably, how do you negotiate that with reading demons, and then reading demons in the current cultural moment when prison abolition and police brutality are a big topic of conversation. Dostoevsky remains relevant in very real ways because we're asking these very deep, meaningful questions of who has the right to forgive, who has the right to condemn, and they have real world implications. And so I've just really enjoyed getting to know everyone who's really interested in Dostoevsky and creating a community where we can all engage with his work in just a really no pressure kind of way. We try out ideas. We have a lot of fun with it. We're continuing our book club and reading Pushkin's Queen of Spades as we read up to reading Crime and Punishment. So we're reading more Russian literature that influenced Dostoevsky. We have read The Master Margarita as well in this book club, as reading some people that were influenced by Dostoevsky. So I think a lot of people will think, oh, Dostoevsky, old Russian guy with really long, depressing books. But when you Google Dostoevsky or you search it on Twitter or something, there's a lot more than just boring, depressing, or murder and daddy issues. There's a lot of stuff going on there. People are engaging with it. There's a conception of people who read Dostoevsky have kind of a reputation. Oh, everyone knows somebody who's learning Russian to read Dostoevsky, just like we saw in The Queen's Gambit. There's a character who's doing that. In a lot of other media, Dostoevsky will be brought up. There's a popular show on Netflix. I think 40 million people watched the second season called You. And there's a thread of Crime and Punishment, interpretation of Crime and Punishment that is threaded through that series. And I disagree with the way the show interpreted it. So we have a lot of fun talking about the ways Dostoevsky is presented in popular culture, the way he is interpreted, and maybe some of those misconceptions, or as people pick how they want to read something. And maybe, our work as scholars is often, prove it, show me in the text. And so we do a lot of that work with our memes, with our book club, with our discussion of how is Dostoevsky being presented, but how is he being received as well? What are people getting out of this? I think one of my favorite moments has been when people will bring up that quote, the prison quote that is attributed to Dostoevsky, but he pretty much definitely did not say. And even the Supreme Court has quoted that, misquoted Dostoevsky, the degree of civilization can be judged by entering its prisons. And we just have a lot of fun with how are people misunderstanding Dostoevsky, how are people reappropriating his work. We have a lot of talk about the right versus the left interpretations of Dostoevsky. He was people who are studying socialism or people who are fans of thinkers like Jordan Peterson, how they have very different receptions of Dostoevsky, and they basically have different Dostoevskys. And where would the truth lie? Who knows? But with it being so much, he's dead, long since dead, and this is his bicentenary, it's really up to us to figure out how we keep watch over Dostoevsky's work, his interpretations, and the ways people are using the things that he said. So that's kind of what I had for today. I really just think it's important for us to remember that outside of the academy, people have their own interpretations of Dostoevsky, and for scholars to be engaging with that is really important. We're the ones who are experts on this stuff. We've dedicated our lives to researching it. So, tweeting about it and saying, hey, Joe from you, that is not what Dostoevsky was doing. That's our job. So I really like doing this work. I really like being a part of this community inside and outside of the academy. And I think it helps us to keep track of what we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Again, one last reminder for people who want to ask questions to our speakers, you can send them to our Canon email at Canon. To Canon at wilsoncenter.org via Twitter and at Kennet Institute or on our Facebook page. I would like to begin with a question for everybody, and it kind of follows up on what Caitlin was discussing. And we've talked about his universal values and all the things that make Dostoevsky great. But to what extent, and I think everyone should comment on this, is to what extent is he a modern writer? That what we feel when we read Dostoevsky is not something that's 200 years old, but is uniquely modern, whether he writes about poverty or faith or the bureaucrats he doesn't like or the lawyers he doesn't like. To what extent is the longevity of Dostoevsky predicated on that he, despite being a 19th century writer, has themes and issues that resonate today?
The world that he described is in many ways the world that we're still living in, and that many of the social issues to do with injustice, to do with abuse, to do with parenting, to do with childhood, to do with prejudice, to do with the power of ideas. And I mean, I would, Tatiana, there is a tendency to talk about Dostoevsky as somebody who sort of philosophizes through his novels. To me, that's a misreading in a way of what he's. I mean, I think in his novels he's talking about the danger of ideas, the danger, the power that how quickly they can spread, partly through misinformation, as we would call it now, and how quickly they can take hold of, especially young people's minds, and the consequences that can lead to, especially if those people are isolated. Again, very resonant for our own times. And in fact, it seems to me that Dostoevsky, in the end of his life, fell victim to some ideas himself, and it's a shame. But then that's also a human truth. That's a general human tendency. Ideas of messianism, of Russia as the Christ-bearing nation. So I think there's all of that. But I also think that the eternal relevance is to do with human nature, human psychology. He starts out, long before he decides to try to understand the essence of Russia, to understand the essence of human being. He says one of his first ever notes is, if I spend all my life trying to understand the mystery of what it is to be human and I don't get there, my life's not wasted. And I think there's so much in what he describes that's still with us. So many young people especially, but many people who have, what can be various types of Raskolnikov syndrome of self-hatred or self-distrust, self-criticism. And I think Dostoevsky is one of many analysts of the human mind who can really help us work through that. I mean, I know that psychologists and psychiatrists have often looked to Dostoevsky. Freud did, R.D. Laing did, wrote an excellent article on crime and punishment. But it seems to me there's huge amount of untapped resources in Dostoevsky that could be of use to therapists of various kinds as well. And I think in terms of relevance for the general reader, that's, he is a writer who seems to help people get through what they're experiencing. And he puts out in his novels some of the worst things that can happen to people and do happen all the time, deaths of young children, for example, or the loss, sudden disasters, accidents, and bereavements. He dramatizes those, and by reading the way in which he refracts his own experience into his fiction, it then helps his readers too to think their own way through it and to feel their own way through it.
If I also may to add a few things to what Oliver said, yes. I also think that what I was mentioning about this Dostoevsky striving for acknowledging everybody's humanity is also very relevant today, when people somehow very often do not wish to be human anymore in any ways, from striving for this technological transhumanist future where people become sort of half cyborgs, to, when you cannot reach that now, to go into this fantasy world where people prefer to be all kinds of mythological beings, from the undead, the werewolves, anybody, even a zombie is better even being a zombie is better than being a human being. And it's actually quite important that Dostoevsky reminds us that it's important to be human. It's really important to be who we are. And at his that is really crucial, because the moment we start giving up on our humanity, we also give up on other people's humanity. And there where we arrive at Raskolnikov, who says that he is not a trembling creature, and the old pawnbroker is a louse who can just be squashed, like an insect, basically. And he kills her sister along with her, the sister whom he claimed to benefit, but he actually takes her life. So that proves him wrong right there. But what is amazing is that he doesn't seem to be overly concerned with the sister. He is excessively concerned only with the murder of the pawnbrokers, because he has dehumanized her so profoundly. He tried to make himself more than a human being, and he tried to make her less as a human being. And then he ends up kind of realizing that they are both human. And that's one of the most important discoveries. And one of the most important discoveries of Dostoevsky, when we talk about, his religion, is that you do not arrive to people from God. You arrive to God from people. You start by loving people and being open to them. And that's how you arrive to believing in God. And that's quite a remarkable path, I think, that he charts out for his human being. And it's something that is relevant today, maybe in some other terms, but something that we can, in addition to what Oliver said about the, exactly, yeah, this count kind of down to the nitty-gritty of our everyday lives. But in a way, we kind of chart out our general journey in the world. Dostoevsky is also very, very relevant.
Yeah, and I would just say, tacking on to that, I've taught Dostoevsky in jails before, and I know in Dostoevsky scholarship, the epilogue of Crime and Punishment can be a source of like, oh, it's tacked on, oh, I don't like it. But I remember when I was teaching at one time in jail, one of my students said, the epilogue has to be there, because otherwise, what's the point? If you're not getting to where Raskolnikov is able to choose love and get that potential for redemption, that there's a very different message being sent to the reader of, oh, like we end with 2 lines of ellipses. It's stylistically cool, but thematically, it doesn't do what the epilogue ultimately allows the novel to do. And one of my students said, doing this work in jail while I'm sitting here where Raskolnikov was also sitting in Siberia, right? And thinking it is a choice, and you do get to choose, what are you going to choose, love or not? And I think just that experience of reading Dostoevsky never gets less powerful, at least for me, and in the classroom that I've seen, it just continuously it packs a punch of, this is life-changing, this is moving, and this makes you think about the big, deep questions in very real, nitty-gritty kind of ways, because he does go into the mundane daily life of people, but also these very big, like, I'm an extraordinary man kind of questions, or what do I do now that I've committed this unforgivable crime? And I think it's just really important that we are thinking about these questions in modern life, and Dostoevsky gives us a way to mediate that experience of thinking about them in kind of a safe way. Oddly enough, we don't have to necessarily think about our own life. We can think about Raskolnikov's life, and how does that transpose back onto ours. So.
Very good. We do have some questions. So the first question comes from Barbara Blank, and she asks, to what degree do Dostoevsky's political views still diminish, or do they, in readers' minds, his extraordinary gifts as a writer and psychologist? Does anyone want to talk about the political views of Dostoevsky?
Well, I think it's important to, I mean, I would love to know exactly which views they're thinking in that question, but I know that there's a lot of, some people have difficulty with, the anti-Semitism that you can find in his work. And it's difficult to lead a fan community when you have someone who's got some very problematic views. But I think when we read Dostoevsky and we think about the more problematic views that he did hold, we remember he's human. And I also think a lot about what's in the novel itself and what's part of Dostoevsky's biography. So reading his texts, you can say, well, it's in the mouth of this character. This is writing. This character might be an anti-Semite. When you read it in his personal correspondence and writing, it's a little different. Or if you're thinking about how he viewed socialism and the social utopian thinkers of the time, like how he's engaging with Chernyshevsky. I don't know who's reading Chernyshevsky for the most part these days, except Dostoevsky scholars and Slavists. But that's another thing you have to think about socialism within the 1860s and the 19th century, and it's different than we understand it to be now. So thinking about the history of ideas and the evolution of ideas from Dostoevsky's time to ours is really important when we're engaging with his political philosophies in terms of what they mean now.
Someone else want to weigh in about the politics of Dostoevsky?
Sure, I'm happy to. And then I'll pass over to you, Tatiana. I don't have that much I want to say desperately, but I mean, many of the views are very distressing for those of us who feel, an affinity for Dostoevsky. Many other ways to find the hatred that he had for certain groups. There's the very appalling anti-Semitic statements in his later work, and it's not just in the journalism. It does also color the novels to a degree. So the pawnbroker in Crime and Punishment is described as being as rich as a yid. Is the only way of translating the word by another character, not in Dostoevsky so much, but one feels it there, even lightly. In general, the novels are, as I've already tried to say, more intelligent than the journalism, it seems to me, and more, he manages to overcome the dominance of those views. I think it's, it'd be easy to imagine what Dostoevsky would think about the Ukraine situation and what side he would be on and what he would be militating for. And a few of us would probably agree with those views. And he remains a writer who, again, many thinkers on the, especially Russian political and intellectual spectrum, can use for very, very different purposes. You can read Dostoevsky, for example, as a virulently anti-capitalist author if you choose to, and you can find evidence for that. There are all sorts of ways in which, in some ways, that's a sign of great literature, that it's open to so many different interpretations. In other ways, it can, of course, be dangerous if those interpretations are held to be universal truths. I was trying to show, in a way, that although even in his late speech, late work, where he's talking about, Russia as being really the great hope for civilization, even there's this search for something universal that goes, I think, beyond that. And that must be what has resonated with readers of all faiths around the world, all faiths and none. Yeah.
I also think it is rather dangerous to pretend something does not exist when it does, and to try to close our eyes to all kinds of pernicious ideas, saying that we don't want to see them, therefore we shall pretend that they are not there, will simply give them room to live and thrive. So we actually need to recognize that they are there. With Dostoevsky, it's particularly dangerous because, not dangerous, but particularly difficult, because he could take his own ideas, which he cherished, and give it to his characters, which he did not particularly kind of hold up as ideals, and he would twist his own thoughts in just a little bit. And they would seem similar to what he said, but they would be completely different. And so the readers have to distinguish between the two. But they were definitely ideas that just shock and kind of upset and sadden people who love Dostoevsky, but I think that's all the better reason to engage with them, to understand to what degree they actually permeate the world and the culture, and to try to disentangle them from the thing that Dostoevsky has to say to keep us up, basically, and to help.
If I can chip in on that very briefly, I mean, that seems to me, in a way, very in the spirit of Dostoevsky himself, but for all his views of one kind or another, one very good legacy of his public activity was always that, you know, for freedom of speech, for all ideas of all kinds to be openly discussed, and because only by doing that, and that just reinforces your point, Tatiana, can the foolishness or the perniciousness of one or other idea be actually demonstrated and not be allowed to sort of fester as something that's banned and forbidden. And that is, you know, that's something that he stood, you know, he was very much against serfdom, but he was almost as passionately against censorship, which is something he suffered from himself a great deal.
I've been thinking about that. Just imagine in our COVID times, we just say we don't like COVID, so we pretend it's not there. It's not going to be a very good policy. It might kind of give us emotional satisfaction, but it will very, very soon destroy us in a very real way. So that's probably why it's important to notice things that upset us as much as to notice things that buoy us, basically.
Thanks very much. I remind our audience that you can send our questions to Kennan@wilsoncenter.org via Twitter, to @KennanInstitute, and on our Facebook page. This question is from Gwendolyn Mutuno, and they ask, every 5 years since I was 18 years old, I've reread The Brothers Karamazov. I'm 74 now, we'll read it again next year. Each time I read it, it seems like a different book. What is it about Dostoevsky that creates that impression?
I think it's not only about Dostoevsky, but it's about us. I mean, if every 5 years we've grown, we've changed, we notice different things in the text. We find different statements more relevant to ourselves than previous years when we read it. Maybe we identify more with Dmitri this year than we did last time, and we identified more with Ivan. I think you can read it so many different ways that as you approach it as a different person, every time you read it, you're going to get something new and you're going to notice different things. I know reading it in book club, reading his text in book club, I noticed tons of different things because of the people I'm reading with. So that's another thing, I think, reading it with other people, having conversations about it with other people, you're going to find different points of view, things people found important and noticed.
But what's important there is Dostoevsky gives us at our different ages and with our different experiences something to latch on. So there is indeed a wealth of thought and emotion and perceptions that he put into his novels that speak to us at different stages of our life. I'm just very concerned about it because there is a very popular notion that has been in the sort of the in thing for decades, that the meaning is created by the reader. And, you know, the perception of a work of art is created by the person who perceives it. Well, that's not quite true. Well, we choose and pick and choose, but we focus, zoom onto something. But a really great work of art will have all the materials there for us to engage with. So we need to have something, because otherwise we don't really need Dostoevsky. We can just ponder on our own experiences and create something for ourselves. But that's the great thing about Dostoevsky, that he helps us focus on what we need at this particular moment in time, because he has such a abundance of things, of, as I said, thoughts, emotions in his works.
My comments are a bit more anecdotal, but I was working on the translation for quite a long time, so I had plenty of opportunities to talk to people about their experience of reading Dostoevsky. It's probably my only subject of conversation. It was amazing how often people said, oh, Crime and Punishment. Oh, yes, I read that a long time ago. I must have been 15, 16 or 17. I don't really remember it that well. So in a way that speaks to what you've both mentioned. But it's had a bad impact on that novel, I think, because people read that at precisely the wrong age. They read it when they're taking Raskolnikov's ideas much too seriously. Not that they want to go and murder, but the idea of, are we extraordinary people? Do we have special rights that other people don't have? The very ideas that get, dissolved over the course of the novel, when Raskolnikov eventually is brought to the realization, I only did it because I wanted to see whether I could dare to, a very, in some ways, childish motivation. It's then helped this particular novel have a reputation of being the kind of the younger, more juvenile Dostoevsky novel compared to the later ones, so that Raskolnikov is often seen as a shallower version of Ivan Karamazov, for example, in the Brothers Karamazov, which I just don't agree with. So it's interesting also how that the time in which various cultures, I'm just talking here about British culture, I don't know what stage this novel tends to be read elsewhere, but it's interesting that here it tends to be read by people who are at the same kind of stage of life as the main character, whereas that novel has at least two perspectives in play. It also has Dostoevsky's own perspective as a 45 or whatever-year-old man, who in a way went through all of that a long time ago and is seeing things differently now. And I think we should do the same with his novels, read them at different times of our life and see the different facets that they reveal.
Our next question is from Shipra Shukla, and the question is, were there any specific philosophers who influenced Dostoevsky? If so, who?
A lot. I'll let Tatiana go.
I'm afraid that the list would be really, really very, very long. And sometimes it's difficult to spot the influence, because Dostoevsky would discuss, one of Dostoevsky's friends left a memoir where he said that I would be telling Fyodor Mikhailovich an idea of some philosopher. And Dostoevsky would say, well, I thought the same thing. It's nice to, it's hard to come up with something new, but it's nice to know that other people have thought of the same. So the question of influence is not always easy to determine. But personally, I would say that he has a lot in common with the German philosopher Friedrich Schelling. They have the same approach to human freedom, very much so, in the negative way, as a kind of opponent. One could quote Auguste Comte, who is today mostly known as the father of sociology, but he was also a philosopher, and he also created his own religion of the humanity, with La Humanité being its goddess, and he himself being its high priest. Kant was also the originator of positivism, which was Dostoevsky's pet hate, really. And then there were Russian philosophers, then of course, who were not formal philosophers, but thinkers with whom he engaged in a variety of ways. Chernyshevsky was already mentioned, and Chadaev was mentioned repeatedly. And their thought had a more of a kind of prompted Dostoevsky into a debate, into a dispute, not into an agreement, but it's someone, these are the people who are very important to read. The so-called Slavophile philosophers in Russia with whom he agreed. And then later, there is the religious philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, whom Dostoevsky knew at the end of his life. It's hard to speak about an influence directly, but they might have shared some ideas.
I think it's always a good idea to look for clues in the actual texts themselves, actual mentions of philosophers. It's usually, as you were saying, an antagonistic relationship. But when he meant, trying to think of the ones he mentions most often, Rousseau, for example, and Schiller. These are, usually when he mentions them, it's in a sort of satirical vein, satirizing the idea of man's return to nature, getting away from civilization, that, we would be better off if we did, or Schiller, the ennobling influence of art on society. But actually the very fact that he's keeps coming back to these names and wrestling with them, I think is evidence actually of a sort of ongoing dialogue and influence. So those are the two names that come out of me in terms of the ones that he actually mentions in the work, or his characters mention. And Rousseau, of course, is so important to Dostoevsky's contemporary Tolstoy.
Yeah, I wrote my dissertation about Dostoevsky's reading of Rousseau and Rousseau's readers, actually, where I contend that he had a different understanding of Rousseau and was more satirizing his readers than anybody else, sort of in a, if you're reading Rousseau this way, you're going to have a bad time kind of way. And Chernyshevsky, Chade, Solovyov. Yeah, I think we've got all the names down, but there's a lot of influence in there. Balzac, I mean, he's maybe not a philosopher, more a novelist, but there's so much that he's engaging with and interacting with and referencing throughout all of his work.
So we have another question dealing with Nabokov, who once said that non-Russian readers do not realize that not all Russians love Dostoevsky as much as Americans do. Do you think that this is true? And what is the state of Dostoevsky in the current Russia? I mean, obviously, there are commemorations. Putin just visited the Dostoevsky Museum in St. Petersburg. But is it fair to say that his worldview is more amenable to Americans or Westerners struggle more with Dostoevsky, or is he still held in such high esteem in Russia?
Dostoevsky is held in very high esteem in Russia, although definitely not everybody loves him, but you don't need to love somebody to recognize that somebody is a genius, really. And I don't even think there is a particular need to love all the Russian classics for anybody. You just have to engage with them in some way. As for Nabokov, I think he was speaking to a large degree about himself when he said that not all Russians love Dostoevsky. And I don't mean to offend Nabokov, but I'm not going to be the first to mention it, that there might have been a tiny bit of kind of jealousy of one writer for another, or just a complete mismatch of their writing styles and their approaches to, and complete mismatch of their writing styles and approaches to life. Nabokov's lecture on Russian literature are quite amazing in that aspect, when he dissects the gospel reading scene and basically brands Dostoevsky as a tasteless and incompetent writer. So, he has an argument.
He has an argument, but I think he couldn't have been more wrong, personally. And he certainly had a large agenda, and his own early period novels would not have happened without Dostoevsky, who he continually parodies, but also imitates in terms of plots and situations. It's a very, Nabokov has a clear agenda. Obviously, he doesn't like the way Dostoevsky writes, but he was also somebody who clearly, I think, was very affected by his encounter with Dostoevsky on the page. And he even does mention that in those lectures. He does mention that Crime and Punishment had an overwhelming, I can't remember the exact word, had a massive influence on him. In my introduction, I think I called him Dostoevsky's most ungrateful reader, which I think is about right. But in terms of his standing in Russia, I mean, I have met a lot of Russians who can't abide Dostoevsky for various reasons. And I think it's probably a lot to do with the nationalism of the later thought. But the first book I ever translated from Russian was by the contemporary writer Yuri Buida, and I knew him, and we would talk. And he would say, people go on and on about the messianism, the nationalism. They don't understand that the main message from Dostoevsky is about freedom. Do we want freedom? This was in the 1990s, the late 1990s, going back to Chubai's conversation, or would we rather, sacrifice our freedom? This is a big question of the brothers Karamazov, for the comfort of, of having our needs taken care of by whatever authoritarian leader you choose to have. Yeah? Are we equal to the responsibility that freedom imposes? And, I think that's been a very painful question that has also ensured his relevance in the post-Soviet period among Russians.
I also feel that many people have some kind of a visceral reaction to a lot of misery that Dostoevsky depicts, and not always connected with his philosophy or politics, but just with a kind of state of human suffering, because there is that. And when Caitlin was talking about memes, I was thinking about a kind of meme on the internet that treating depression with Dostoevsky is like treating alcoholic addiction with heroin, because he just can produce such a kind of dark impression. But I think it just takes going deeper into him to see what Oliver was mentioning, that his ideas that make it worth living, basically, and make it worthwhile being a human being, because he presents us as free, and this freedom as being our crucial feature. And despite, it would be pointless to say that there is no suffering, that everything is basically peachy in the world. So it's important to point that out. But he also says that it doesn't need to be that way, and we need to look for answers not only outside but within. And that's something that is important despite all the problems that people might have with Dostoevsky.
I want to follow up on the last point about freedom and the need to think from within. One of the most striking things about his novels is his attitude toward the legal reforms of the 1860s and his dislike of several lawyers, and his biting commentary in the one case, in the Diary of a Writer, in the Cronenberg case of Vladimir Spasovich. So how do you reconcile his deep interest in these legal reforms, that he bases one of his novels on the Nechayev conspiracy, but his dislike of lawyers? And is that something that Chubais is actually responding to when he says that Dostoevsky doesn't understand a more contemporary reality?
I think it's Dostoevsky's fear as the reforms began to be put into practice was that it was the lawyers who would cease to understand contemporary reality. And this goes back to that whole sort of dichotomy I was talking about earlier, that in a way, yes, he's writing literature, but he's also writing in many cases against the dangers of literature. And he was very worried that these new, trial by jury, and with the importance given to the counsels to make the case to the lawyers, that they would simply get wrapped up in their own rhetoric, their own performance, and they would actually lose sight of the issues at stake, the suffering that's actually being caused, the living reality behind the legal case. And he thought it would just, his worry was that the reforms were pushing legal practice into this abstract realm of complacent performance.
I mean, he brings up in Diary of a Writer and in texts of his problematic cases where, testifying against the dad who killed your mom is going to get you in trouble when the jury nullifies the verdict and you're sent back to live with him. What happens then? And I think he like in as with many of his novels, he says, okay, if that's the case, what happens when this is the case under these rules and in this system? What is, like, if you push it to the furthest extreme, this might happen. So what are you going to do about it? I don't think he necessarily had solutions for everything, but he did know how to point out a problem really well.
And I think one of his problems with lawyers was when they fought tooth and nail to acquit, to have their charges acquitted, they basically, again, well, not only they condoned crime, but they presented people in a light that Dostoevsky didn't, that Dostoevsky despised, because they presented them as victims of the environment, of the social circumstances. And there is one instance when he speaks about a lawyer who talks about a woman who kept her daughter's hand under boiling water. And he says, the lawyer says that she could not do anything else, being so pressed by the environment. And Dostoevsky is deeply upset with that kind of taking the agency from a human being, basically making them puppets of the outside world. And he also was very concerned about proper kind of citizen qualities of being civil-minded. He compares English juries and Russian juries, and says the juries in England. He says England, so I apologize for using the in Britain. Let's put it this way. He says the juries in Britain are very civic-minded. They are real citizens. They do their duty, while juries in Russia approach their task with a kind of "do not judge lest you be judged" frame of mind, and they basically let criminals go because they are compassionate for their plight. And he says that Russian jurors have to follow the example of the British jurors. Trouble is that when he depicts a real trial in the Brothers Karamazov, his juries do what his jury does what he wants, jurors do what he wants them to do, and they end up convicting the wrong man. So he was very adept at seeing all kinds of dangers that basically ambush people in the world, in any system. And so he would have different views in his journalistic writings and his works, as Caitlin said several times, and that is so true, that you cannot use his journalism to gauge what he says in his novels, because that can be so different. But he was a very serious and a very thorough thinker. And he viewed everything from many, many angles, and that's something to be learned from him as well, I think.
We have one final question from Paul here, and he asks, who are your favorite Dostoevsky characters and why? Who wants to take that one up?
My favorite Dostoevsky character is Nastasia Filipovna. I think she's incredible. I think she's crazy, and I love the way she's written. Of the Brothers Karamazov, my favorite is Dmitri, because he's a hot mess. And I just love seeing him be a disaster throughout the text. And I love Razumikhin. He's amazing. I would be friends with that guy. So.
Oliver or Tatiana? Favorite character?
Caitlin, thank you very much for drawing a distinction between liking somebody as a character and liking somebody kind of as an underlying person. And if you're talking about as liking somebody as a person in Dostoevsky's novels, I would also say Razumikhin. He is, somebody you can be friends with. But if talking about just a character and the way the character is written, I would say The Underground Man, because it's just such a neatly written piece of literature. I just can put it in no other way. It's just so wonderfully written, and so so complex and complicated that it just takes my breath away.
Oliver, do you want to weigh in, or?
I've now had 5 minutes to think about it, and I still can't make my mind up. I'm sure as soon as this session is finished, I'll remember exactly what I should have mentioned. But what I would point out is that sometimes the so-called secondary characters, they have an incredible ability to live in the reader's mind, despite the fact that they seem so tangential in many cases to the plot. And just if we take Crime and Punishment, both the drunkard Marmeladov, with his extraordinary speech in the second, again, that knife edge of comedy and tragedy, where there's somebody who cannot accept the test of freedom, and yet talks about it in a way that can move us to both tears and laughter. But then also, his wife Katerina Ivanovna, who is given just a few pages in the novel, and people often take away from Dostoevsky, from that novel, especially when I teach it to students, there's often an objection to the representation of women, that Sonia seems seemingly passive, although I'd argue with that too in the novel. And but take Katerina Ivanovna, who expresses the defiance of somebody who doesn't accept God's world in a way that's just as powerful within the short space that she's given, as we see in the later great novels by other tormented characters who can't accept the reality around them. So he's an incredibly fertile novelist when it comes to character, and I think that's again part of the legacy, that these characters are waiting for us to sort of continue talking and extending them one way or another.
Thank you, Oliver. Well, we've come to the end of our time, but I want to thank the panelists and thank you very much for joining us in the audience. I do hope that as a result of this conversation, people will go back and reread Dostoevsky. I know that when we interview people, we often still find candidates and people who have gotten into Russian studies through first a Dostoevsky novel. And so it's still very relevant. And I just want to thank all our panelists, and I look forward to continuing this discussion. We will put this this meeting on our account, and thank you all again for participating in today's lively discussion. Thanks very much.